Thank you. Excellent. Well, thank you, David, and thank you to the Camden Conference for having me. It's a great pleasure, and to all of you for attending here on a Sunday. Indeed, I run Nationhood Lab, where I study and write about the problems of U.S. nationhood, how to solve for them, and how to defend the liberal democratic experiment. Now, apparently, we're not doing this very well, because we Americans are no longer standing on the edge of an abyss. We've dove right in. And nothing's going to be the same in our lifetimes. Americans are getting a tragic crash course right now on what it's like to live under an unstable authoritarian regime. We'll also learn shortly if we, are capable of standing up for our founding ideals, of fighting for our freedom now that indeed it has to be fought for. I know we can do it. The question is if we will. People sometimes say, hey, this isn't who we are. Well, it's not who we should be, but it's very much who we've been at various junctures in our past. In this context this morning, I want to share two things with you, which I think will be important in moving forward. The first is how we got here, an explanation for why it is that the United States, despite its myriad advantages, is, and for almost all of its existence, has been divided against itself, and thus vulnerable to collapse. And secondly, to draw your attention to a key strategy we've been working on for the past year at Nationhood Lab that can help hold us together against the forces of autocracy that have now seized power and threaten to bring down the republic and shatter the Union. Now, I'll discuss that second point in a few minutes, but to really understand the situation today, I want to start with what I hope will be some helpful deep background information on the fundamental characteristics of the U.S. Federation, characteristics that have made this country more structurally vulnerable than many of its liberal democratic peers. Here is an essential and often overlooked fact of our national experience. The U.S. is not a nation state at all, and never has been. We're a collection of stateless nations, each with their own intents, ideals, and stories of national purpose. These regional cultures, which don't respect state or even international boundaries, have never been in agreement over the big questions. What's the proper role of government? What's the proper relationship and balance between church and state? Or even the meaning of such keywords in the American lexicon as freedom or liberty. These stateless nations, these regional cultures, go back to the beginning of European conquest and settlement, to the 17th and early 18th centuries. The original clusters of colonies were settled by people from distinct regions of the British Isles, and from France and the Netherlands and Spain, each with their own religious, political, and ethnographic characteristics. Each was first colonized at a separate time and under a different political model. Some championed individualism, others utopian social reform. Some embraced an explicit Anglo-Protestant identity, others ethnic and religious pluralism. Some valued equality and democratic participation, others deference to an aristocratic order modeled on the slave states of classical antiquity. The Puritan project in New England had little in common with the neo-feudal aristocratic society of the Chesapeake country, or with the Dutch commercial colony encompassing what's now Greater New York City, or New Spain's far-flung northern frontier, or the West Indies slave society transplanted to the deep southern lowlands by English planters from Barbados. For generations, these discrete Euro-American cultures developed in remarkable isolation from one another, consolidating their own cherished principles and fundamental values, and expanding across the eastern half of the continent in nearly exclusive settlement bands. They saw themselves as competitors for land, for settlers, for capital, and even as enemies, taking opposing sides in the English Civil War of the 1640s, in the Glorious Revolution, in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and of course, the Civil War. Here, by the way, is a map of the Spanish colonization of the Southwest. The areas that are shaded are the areas actually boots on the ground settled by the Spanish prior to the US annexations. But the point I'm making is that there's never been an America, but rather several Americas. And today, there are 11. To see their effect, you actually have to use county-level data because, like I said, the settlement patterns did not follow state boundaries. Now, there isn't time today in this format to describe them to you now, but suffice to say that they've always been divided on the key issues with profound effects on American history and society. They don't agree, for instance, on how to create a society where humans can be maximally and sustainably free. Do you emphasize individual liberty, as the Scots-Irish-inflected warrior culture of Greater Appalachia does, or the common good, as did the Puritans, where their belief, as we were discussing yesterday, that they're in an old-style covenant with God and tasked to build a more godly society in the American wilderness? In other words, is freedom ultimately about maximizing the autonomy of the individual, about personal sovereignty in an absence of restraints, especially, but not exclusively, from government? If we had less government, less taxes, less regulation, would we not as individuals axiomatically be more free? Or is it that freedom is about building and maintaining the infrastructure and institutions of a free society? The schools and parks, roads and bridges, public universities, libraries, and clinics that act as a leveling mechanism to ensure each person has a fair shot at achieving their potential of being meaningfully free, regardless of the circumstances of their birth? Is it, in other words, a shared endeavor, a social project, the cultivation of a Republican citizenry? The answer, laid out in American Character, is that an optimally functioning liberal democracy, small l, small d, maintains a balance between these two essential forces of freedom, to have them in equilibrium. Our problem is that the regional cultures disagree on the balance point, or in some cases where there should be any balance at all. Our politics, up until 2016 anyway, centered on this question of individual liberty or the common good, which is why you see that map I showed you before reflected in so many others, like county-level election results. This is the 1916 presidential map, Woodrow Wilson versus Charles Hughes, when the Republicans, in red, were the party of communitarian values, and the Democrats, in blue, were the party of individual liberty and racial apartheid. Notice the communitarian regions, which are Yankeedom, New Netherland around New York City, and left coast, that strip you see there, which had a separate settlement history than the interior of those states and provinces, all lined up with the Republicans, whereas the individual liberty nations, which the classics are Deep South, Greater Appalachia, and Far West, lined up with the latter. This is the 2008 map. Barack Obama versus John McCain. Same map pretty much, except the colors have reversed, because by this time, the parties had reversed their platforms, ideologies, and regional constituencies. Also, Latinos and African Americans were able to vote, which you're seeing El Norte appear up on the map. But the regional divide has affected many other things. For instance, the response to a contagious, deadly airborne virus. You can see here how the individual liberty nations hobbled the United States' response to the COVID-19 pandemic, resisting mask wearing and vaccines, both at the citizen level and the public leader level. And the vaccine uptake is mapped here by Nationhood Lab by regional culture as of August 15th, 2021. We chose that because that's a time when vaccines had been freely available and you really could get them for many weeks. So if you weren't getting them, it's because it was not an urgent priority for you. Some of the communitarian nations at that point had almost double the per capita vaccination level of the Deep South. And not unrelated, these are the per capita COVID-19 deaths by county for that summer from the New York Times. Remember, that was the Delta variant summer. By the end of the pandemic, by the way, we calculated the numbers. Almost 250,000 Deep Southerners were killed in the COVID-19 pandemic. That's a rate of 505 per 100,000 people, or 2.5 times the per capita death rate in Yankeedom, and 5 times the rate in Hawaii, Greater Polynesian cultural space, but more importantly, Hawaii could seal itself off as a practical matter and gives you a control on the experiment if you didn't have people moving around trans-regionally. You see these regional divides in the prevalence of other diseases. Here's diabetes prevalence from the CDC. Blue is good, red is bad, as processed by my team and our academic collaborators at the University of Illinois Chicago and the Minneapolis-based Health Partners Institute. Deep South and Greater Appalachia have a problem. This is the results we got for obesity. This is life expectancy, as my project revealed in a viral Politico story we wrote in 2023. We found 3 to 5 year population level differences between the large regions. That might not sound like a lot, but at a population level, that's a gap comparable to that separating the United States from Bulgaria, Libya, and the Philippines, respectively. And the gaps did not go away when we parsed by the urbanity, ruralness, impoverishment, education level, or access levels to quality health care of the counties involved. These, from the Washington Post, are FICO credit scores by county. Blue is bad, gold is good. Think about it. There are lots of incredibly rich counties in that blue blob, and a lot of very, very poor ones in the gold one, like Washington County in easternmost Maine, off on the far right there, which has the lowest per capita income in the entire Northeast. Little appreciated is how much the incidence of gun violence, like so many salient issues in American life, varies by region. Here, again using CDC data, we map the per capita rate for gun deaths by county between 2010 and 2020 cumulative. The Deep South's annual per capita rate of 15.6 per 100,000 residents is about double that of Yankeedom and 4 times that of New Netherlands. In Greater New York City, the most densely populated and diverse part of the entire continent. New Netherlands' rate of 3.8 per 100,000 isn't much higher than that of Switzerland. The gaps, by the way, persist or grow wider if you look at just urban counties compared across the regions, or just rural counties, or just homicides, or just suicides, or just where the victim was white, or just where the victim was black. Not unrelated, here's every fatal white supremacist mob action in the United States between 1835 and 1964, both lynchings and riots as mapped by the Monroe Work Today research group. The orange dots represent an incident where African Americans were killed. The yellow dots are Latino victims. And it profoundly affected 19th and early 20th century immigration. This, also from the Census Bureau, we calculated the percentage of foreign-born people in 1900 by county. Notice nobody went to Tidewater in the Deep South and barely to Greater Appalachia. You're talking 20-fold differences in the presence of foreigners in that time period, further reinforcing identity and demographic differences between the regions. And this, in turn, affected the distribution of religious traditions. Here, from the Association of Statisticians of American Religious Bodies U.S. Religion Census, are the dominant religions in each county today. Red is Southern Baptist. You can see a green Methodist belt in the Midlands, if you remember that map before. Gray is LDS, from the Mormons. And blue is Catholic, the largest religious group amongst that great 1880 to 1924 immigration wave that so profoundly changed ideas about American identity, forcing legacy Protestant America, kicking and screaming, to recognize that henceforth Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Jews, at least, would be allowed to be full-fledged Americans. Except none of that happened in the 3 southern regions. That Baptist zone you see there is the legacy of the spatial maldistribution of that great immigration wave. The only part of the country where the Christian nationalism we were talking about yesterday, the notion that America is a country that is created by and for evangelical Protestant Christians, it's the only place that can find fertile soil, because anywhere else on the continent, it is obviously in your day-to-day life not the case and hasn't been for 7 generations now. So it has massive political effects. So my point is, the divides are real, they're persistent, and they matter for democracy and much else besides. So that brings us to the second question. What holds us together? What's ever held us together? Because the regional cultures, those 6 eastern ones on the eastern seaboard anyway, wound up together in an accident of history. They came together in 1776 to fend off a common threat, a change in British imperial policy that threatened to destroy the relative autonomy of each of their individual political and social systems. And, miraculously, they won. And they found themselves in something called the United States. But nobody really knew what that was. The United States of America came into being as a contractual agreement, a means to an end for the parties involved. Nobody at the time thought they had just created a nation state, like Holland or Prussia or post-revolutionary France were. Its people lacked a shared history religion, or ethnicity. They didn't speak a unique language all their own. They hadn't occupied the continent long enough to have a sense of dwelling in a mythic homeland since time immemorial, and they'd killed or pushed out the people who could make such a claim, or were still doing so. They lacked a shared political heritage apart from the imperial ties they'd just revolted against. In short, they had none of the foundations with which one builds a nation state. They had no story to bring and hold them together. Now, such stories are required of every nation, be it Germany or Hungary or Japan or ourselves. Because as individuals, to feel that we have fealty to something as abstract as a nation, to feel that we owe it greater loyalty than to others, that we are bound to its fellow members more closely than we are bound to those who are not, that we might ultimately give our lives for it, that requires a compelling and credible story, an idea that's evocative and feels true on some level, that has footings in the past and gives us an answer for why we are indeed in this together. A society without such a credible story, the historian William McNeill wrote 35 years ago, soon finds itself in deep trouble. For in the absence of believable myths, coherent public action becomes difficult to improvise or sustain. Our national story then had to be created ex post facto, decades later, starting in the 1830s really, a story I tell in my most recent book, Union. And it's the one thing that's held us together, more or less, ever since, but it's been contested from the outset. That story said that, yes, we may lack a shared history, religion, or ethnicity, but what we share are a set of ideals, the ones from that famous passage in the opening to the Declaration of Independence: the inherent equality of humans, their rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and representative self-government. To be American is to be committed to this set of propositions about the nature of the universe. These are good ideals, a natural right granted to humans by God or nature, or as the Declaration puts it, nature's God, to survive, to not be tyrannized, to pursue our happiness as we each understand it, and have equal access to the representative self-government that makes it all possible. And that we're in a covenant, again from yesterday, as Americans, to protect one another's rights to these things. These are the ideals that Frederick Douglass fought for in every speech he gave. This is Lincoln at Gettysburg and Martin Luther King Jr. at the Mall. It's our civic national ideal, the American promise. But those ideals were contested immediately, in real time from the 1830s onward, by a counter-narrative, first crafted by a circle of Southern intellectuals who said, no, the Declaration is wrong. Humans are not created equal. Only the Anglo-Saxon race, they declared, had the genius and ability to secure the promises in the Declaration. We're a classical republic like ancient Greece and Rome, where a minority have the privilege or liberty to practice democracy, and subjugation and slavery are the natural lot of the many. It was an ethno-national and inherently authoritarian vision. The battle between these two visions of America has been our eternal struggle. This was the fight through the antebellum period, in the Civil War and Reconstruction. The ethno-nationalists actually ruled this country federation-wide in the 1910s and 1920s, when the first deep Southern president, Woodrow Wilson, segregated the federal government. When they were pulling down the Confederate statues we've been, until recently, tearing down, putting up the ones that we've been tearing down. And when Birth of a Nation was all the rage, a film celebrating the KKK's successful terrorist campaign to restore white supremacy in the occupied South. When the 1924 Immigration Act imposed racial quotas explicitly to defend the Anglo-Saxon character of the country. The civic national narrative didn't win the argument and become the federation-wide consensus until the 1960s, when the civil rights movement toppled Southern apartheid and challenged Northern racism, when the feminist movement demanded social and professional and sexual equality for a gender that comprised more than half of the population, when gays and lesbians fought the police and discriminatory ordinances, an era when elite colleges began partially dismantling their old boys networks and public universities rapidly expanded to increase educational opportunities. Congress passed a new immigration law in 1965 that repealed the ethno-national quotas, reopening America's gates to humanity at large. And a new generation of historians challenged the neo-Confederate narrative of American history that by then had dominated scholastic textbooks for nearly half a century. And that's when we became a liberal democracy, not in the 1860s, but in the 1960s. In other words, it's not inevitable. It's an incredible gift that had to be fought for and continues to be fought for. Because the forces of autocracy and ethno-nationalism are ascendant, and they have their narrative, their story of the kind of country they're fighting for, all worked out. Make America great again, like it was before that civic national triumph. The rest of us don't have our story worked out, and by that I mean the 70 to 80% of Americans, polling consistently shows, who don't actually want to live in such an authoritarian world. We've lost our story, our message. We, that latent pro-democracy, trans-partisan supermajority. We were never really good as a people at talking about what our civic ideals mean in practice, but we stopped trying after the Cold War, and a vacuum opened up, and demagogues stepped in as they always do. We need that story now. And that's the work we've been doing at Nationhood Lab, the testing, crafting of an emotive, effective American story, one that can be used in ordinary conversation in real-world situations, one that can rally that latent supermajority to defend what should have been America's values for all of these past 249 years. We're releasing the results at the National Press Club on March 12th, a story of pride and reckoning, of an effort to create a society where all people can be meaningfully free. And from here on out, we'll be helping to deploy and promote it. Here on the eve of the semi-quincentennial, say that 10 times fast, the 250th birthday of the Declaration and the unique peoplehood it aspired to create. That effort is aided by the fact that this story of national purpose falls on a sympathetic audience, as our preliminary national baseline poll completed last April showed us, in what was an unexpected and happy surprise. We asked registered voters which statements about the nature of the US they most agreed with. We offered statement pairs about our national purpose, American identity, and the meaning of our past. In each one was keyed off the ideals in the Declaration, the others rooted in more intrinsic characteristics, like ancestry, heritage, character, and values. And the civic ones proved far more attractive, regardless of gender, age, race, education, or region. 63% of Americans overall preferred the statement that we're united not by a shared religion or ancestry or history, but by our shared commitment to a set of American founding ideals, that we have inherent and equal rights to live, to not be tyrannized, to pursue happiness as we each understand it, over an alternative embraced by only 33% of respondents that said we were united by shared history, traditions, and values, and by our fortitude and character as Americans, a people who value hard work, individual responsibility, and national loyalty. I put some crosstabs up here. Green is preference for the civic vision, yellow for the more heritage, ethno-national adjacent constructions. The former was the overwhelming favorite of everyone, with two major exceptions you may see at the bottom. Republicans and those who voted for Trump in 2020, but still, 45% of the respondents from both of those groups preferred the Declaration, joining 63% of independents and 79% of self-identified Democrats. As a starting point, even before we've worked any kind of messaging magic, these were very encouraging numbers. And in late August, we completed the last rounds of polling. And one of the things we did, we tested if Americans agree with that argument, that we are duty-bound as Americans to protect one another's rights to life and liberty, et cetera, right? The covenant. Is that true? Shockingly, they do, by a crazy 97-2 margin, which was the largest spread our pollsters had ever seen on any question they had ever asked. Look, Americans don't agree on whether the earth is flat or round, literally, at those kind of numbers. So Americans value our democracy, but they need leadership, direction, and a sense they're not alone, that they're in this together, that even in this darkening hour, the light of the American promise still burns. And so with that, I invite you to follow our work as it continues to unfold at Nationhood Lab. I should add this is citizen-powered, funded by charitable donations, and I look forward to hearing how and later answering your questions. Thanks so much.